In a quiet little town by the sea, there lived a woman who spent her days stitching clothes for the people around her. She wasn't rich or famous, just an ordinary person trying to make ends meet. Her name wasn't important to most folks, they simply called her the seamstress. But what no one knew was that this seemingly plain woman carried a secret passion deep in her heart. She loved playing the violin. Every evening, after finishing her work, she would climb up to her small attic room. There, under the soft glow of a flickering bulb, she'd take out an old, worn-out violin. It wasn't shiny or expensive, it had scratches and dents from years of use, but it meant everything to her. This violin had belonged to her mother, who had taught her how to play when she was just a child. After her mother passed away, the violin became her closest companion. She didn't have much time to practice during the day because her sewing work kept her busy. But at night, when the world outside grew silent, she poured her soul into every note she played. The music filled the tiny attic, echoing through the wooden beams as if the house itself were listening. Sometimes she played sad tunes that made her think of her mother. Other times, she played lively melodies that made her tap her feet and smile despite the hardships of life. Music gave her strength, comfort, and a way to express things she couldn't put into words. The townsfolk, however, didn't know any of this. To them, she was just the quiet woman who fixed their torn shirts and patched their trousers. They'd barely noticed her unless they needed something stitched. Some even thought she was strange, always keeping to herself. No one imagined that behind her calm exterior lay a hidden talent waiting to be discovered. One day, while delivering some freshly mended dresses to a wealthy merchant's house, she overheard a conversation about an upcoming gala. The event was being organized by the richest families in town, and everyone important would be there. As she stood quietly in the corner, holding the bundle of clothes, she didn't realize that this gathering would soon bring her hidden world crashing into the spotlight. Little did she know, her simple life was about to change forever, and not necessarily in a good way. The merchant's wife was a woman who loved attention. She enjoyed hosting parties, wearing expensive dresses, and making sure everyone admired her. But there was another side to her personality that wasn't so pleasant. She had a sharp tongue, and often found amusement in mocking those she considered beneath her. When she learned that the quiet seamstress owned a violin, a cruel idea began to form in her mind. One afternoon, she sent for the seamstress to come to her house under the pretense of needing some alterations done to a gown. When the woman arrived, the merchant's wife greeted her with an exaggerated smile. "Oh, I've heard such interesting things about you," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "They say you play the violin. Is that true?" The seamstress hesitated, unsure how to respond. She didn't like drawing attention to herself, especially not in front of someone as intimidating as the merchant's wife. But after a moment she nodded shyly. "Yes, ma'am, I do play, but only for myself." "Well, isn't that charming?" The merchant's wife exclaimed, clapping her hands together. "You simply must perform at our upcoming gala. It'll be such a treat for everyone to hear your music." The seamstress felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew this invitation wasn't genuine. It was more of a command than a request. Still, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. I don't think I'm good enough for something like that," she stammered, hoping the other woman would let it go. "Nonsense," the merchant's wife said, her tone growing firmer now. "Everyone deserves a chance to shine, don't they? Besides, it'll add a bit of charm to the evening, a humble performance from one of our very own townsfolk." The seamstress could see the glint of mischief in her eyes. She realized this wasn't about giving her a platform. It was about turning her into a spectacle. The wealthy woman probably expected her to stumble through a clumsy attempt at playing, providing entertainment for the guests through sheer awkwardness. Yet, what choice did she have? Declining would only make things worse. Reluctantly, she agreed, forcing a weak smile. As she left the house, her heart sank. She could already picture the scene, the elegant hall filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, laughing behind their hands as she stood on stage, holding her old, battered violin. They wouldn't see the hours of practice she'd put into learning each piece, or the emotions she poured into every note. All they'd see was a simple woman, easy to ridicule. But deep down, a small spark of defiance ignited within her. She might not be able to avoid the humiliation they planned for her, but she could control how she responded to it. If they wanted a show, she'd give them one, but not the kind they were expecting. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine standing tall in front of that crowd, letting her music speak for itself. As she walked home, her mind raced with doubts and fears, but also with determination. Whatever happened at the gala, she decided she wouldn't let them take away her dignity, not without a fight. The days leading up to the gala felt like a blur for the seamstress. She couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that weighed heavily on her chest. Every time she thought about standing in front of all those people who barely acknowledged her existence, let alone respected her, it made her stomach churn. The whispers, the smirks, the mocking laughter, she could already hear it in her mind. But there was something else too, a quiet voice inside her, urging her not to give up. She spent every spare moment practicing. Her tiny attic room became her sanctuary, the place where she poured out her fears and frustrations through her violin. Each note carried a piece of her soul, her struggles as a child learning from her mother, the loneliness of losing her biggest supporter, and now, the humiliation waiting for her at the gala. Music had always been her escape, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just about playing well anymore, it was about proving something to herself more than anyone else. Her fingers moved across the strings with a newfound intensity. She played until her hands ached and her arms felt too heavy to lift. Some nights, tears streamed down her face as she tried to perfect a difficult passage. Other times, she smiled faintly when a melody came together just right, filling the room with warmth. Even though no one was there to hear her, she imagined an audience watching silently, captivated by the music. That thought gave her strength. Still, doubts crept in whenever she allowed herself to think about the gala. What if they laughed anyway? What if her best wasn't good enough? She knew how cruel people could be. They wouldn't care about her hard work or her dedication. They'd only see her as the poor seamstress trying to do something beyond her station. Those thoughts haunted her, but they also fueled her determination. If she was going to fail, she'd do it on her own terms, with everything she had. On the morning of the gala, she woke up earlier than usual. Her heart raced as she carefully packed her violin into its worn case. She dressed simply, choosing a modest outfit that matched her everyday life. There was no point pretending to be someone she wasn't. As she stepped outside, the crisp air stung her cheeks, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This was it. There was no turning back now. When she arrived at the grand hall, the scene before her was overwhelming. The building sparkled with lights, and elegant carriages lined the street outside. Inside, guests mingled in their finest attire, laughing and sipping champagne. The contrast between their world and hers couldn't have been starker. She clutched her violin case tightly, feeling out of place among the glittering crowd. As she waited nervously backstage, snippets of conversations drifted toward her. Someone mentioned her name, followed by a snicker. Another person joked about whether she'd even know how to hold the violin properly. Each word cut deeper than she expected, but instead of shrinking away, she straightened her posture. She reminded herself why she was here, not for them, but for herself, for her mother, for the countless hours she'd spent practicing in solitude. When her turn finally came, she walked onto the stage with slow, deliberate steps. The murmurs grew louder, and she could feel dozens of eyes boring into her. Some faces wore smirks. Others looked curious, waiting to see what kind of disaster would unfold. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her violin case and lifted the instrument to her shoulder. For a moment, she closed her eyes, blocking out the noise around her. She focused on the sound of her own breathing, the weight of the bow in her hand, and the memory of her mother's encouraging voice. Then, with a deep breath, she began to play. The moment the first note rang out, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, raw and powerful, that seemed to fill every corner of the grand hall. The initial murmurs and snickers from the audience faded almost instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. People froze mid-conversation, their glasses halfway to their lips, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. At first, some of the guests thought it might be a fluke, a lucky stroke, or beginner's luck. But as the seamstress continued to play, there was no denying the depth of her skill. Each note flowed seamlessly into the next, creating melodies so rich and haunting that they tugged at the heartstrings of everyone present. Her music wasn't flashy or overdone, it was pure emotion poured into sound. You didn't need to know anything about violins to understand how special this performance was. The transformation in the room was palpable. Smirks turned into wide-eyed stares, and mocking glances shifted to expressions of awe. Some people leaned forward in their seats, afraid to miss even a single note. Others sat perfectly still, their faces reflecting emotions they hadn't expected to feel that evening: sadness, wonder, joy. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, moved to tears by the beauty of the music. Even the merchant's wife, who had orchestrated the entire setup to mock the seamstress, looked stunned. She sat rigidly in her chair, her lips parted in disbelief. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a pang of guilt, though she tried to push it aside. This wasn't supposed to happen. The woman on stage wasn't meant to shine. She was supposed to stumble and embarrass herself. Yet here she was, commanding the attention of everyone in the room, with nothing but an old violin and her undeniable talent. As the seamstress played, she seemed to forget where she was. Her earlier nerves melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence. With each bow stroke, she let go of the fear and self-doubt that had plagued her for days. Instead, she focused on the music, the one thing that had always been true and constant in her life. It was as if she were sharing pieces of her soul with the audience, letting them see the person she truly was beneath her humble exterior. When she reached the crescendo of her piece, the energy in the room shifted again. The melody soared, filling the space with a sense of triumph and resilience. For those few moments, it felt like time stood still. No one spoke, no one moved. All that existed was the music and the woman playing it. Finally, she drew the last lingering note, holding it until the sound gently faded into silence. When she lowered her violin, the room remained utterly still for a heartbeat and then erupted into applause. It started hesitantly, with scattered claps, but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation. People rose to their feet, cheering and whistling, overcome by what they had just witnessed. Tears streamed down the seamstress's face as she stood there, clutching her violin. She hadn't expected this, not the standing ovation, not the looks of admiration from people who had once dismissed her. For years, she had played only for herself, never imagining anyone would care enough to listen. And yet, here she was, surrounded by strangers whose lives she had touched in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. In that moment, she realized something profound. Her music had given her a voice when words failed. It had allowed her to rise above the mockery and judgment, proving that greatness can come from the most unexpected places. As the applause continued, she took a deep bow, her heart swelling with gratitude, not for the crowd, but for the journey that had brought her here. The applause didn't die down quickly. It went on and on, filling the grand hall with a sound so loud it seemed to shake the chandeliers above. People clapped not because they felt obligated, but because they were genuinely moved. Some even shouted bravo, while others whispered to their neighbors, saying things like, "I can't believe she's been hiding this talent all these years." The seamstress stood there, still holding her violin, overwhelmed by the reaction. She had walked onto that stage expecting ridicule, but instead, she found herself basking in admiration. As the crowd finally began to settle, a few people approached her. One elderly man, dressed in a suit that looked far too expensive for everyday wear, introduced himself as a music critic from the city. "Young lady," he said, his voice trembling with excitement, "that was one of the most remarkable performances I've ever heard. Where did you learn to play like that?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure how to respond. Then softly, she explained about her mother and the countless hours spent practicing alone in her attic. The critic listened intently, nodding as if every word confirmed what he already suspected, that true artistry comes from the heart, not from fancy schools or privileged backgrounds. Others followed, eager to meet her and offer praise. A woman who ran a local charity asked if she'd consider performing at their upcoming fundraiser. Another man, who owned a small theater, invited her to give a concert there. At first, she politely declined most of the offers, feeling unprepared for such attention. But as more people expressed interest, she realized something important. Her music had power. It could bring people together, inspire them, and maybe even change lives, including her own. By the end of the night, the seamstress left the gala with a stack of business cards and invitations tucked into her bag. Her hands shook as she held them, not out of fear this time, but from disbelief. How could everything change so suddenly? Just hours ago, she was an invisible figure in the background of the town's life, and now she was being treated like someone extraordinary. But the surprises didn't stop there. The next morning, news of her performance spread across the town and beyond. Locals who hadn't attended the gala heard about it from friends and family, and soon enough, newspapers picked up the story. Headlines read things like, "Unlikely star shines bright," and "Hidden talent stuns elite crowd." People started showing up at her little sewing shop, not just for alterations, but to catch a glimpse of the woman behind the headlines. Some even brought their children, hoping she might teach them how to play the violin. Amidst all the attention, one interaction stood out. The merchant's wife, the very person who had set out to humiliate her, showed up at her doorstep a few days later. The seamstress opened the door cautiously, unsure what to expect. But instead of mockery or sarcasm, the woman apologized sincerely. "I never meant for this to happen," she admitted, looking genuinely remorseful. "I thought, well, I don't know what I thought, but after hearing you play, I feel terrible about what I did." For a moment, the seamstress considered turning her away. After all, the woman had caused her so much anxiety and dread. Yet, as she looked into the other woman's eyes, she saw real regret. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but she decided to give it. "Thank you for your apology," she said quietly. "I hope we can move forward from this." That conversation marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Over time, the two women grew closer, bonding over shared experiences and mutual respect. The merchant's wife even helped arrange some of the seamstress's early performances, using her connections to introduce her to influential figures in the arts community. Through it all, the seamstress remained humble. She didn't let fame go to her head or forget where she came from. Instead, she used her newfound platform to uplift others. Whether it was mentoring young musicians or donating proceeds from her concerts to local charities, she made sure her success benefited those around her. And though her life changed dramatically, one thing stayed the same. Every evening, she returned to her attic room to practice, reminding herself that no matter how far she went, her love for music would always be her guiding light. Life took on a new rhythm for the seamstress after that unforgettable night at the gala. What had once been quiet evenings spent stitching clothes and practicing violin alone in her attic transformed into a whirlwind of opportunities she never imagined possible. Concert halls, radio interviews, and even television appearances became part of her daily routine. People from all walks of life wanted to hear her story, and more importantly, they wanted to hear her play. But despite the sudden fame, she remained grounded. She knew better than anyone how easy it was to feel invisible, overlooked by society simply because you didn't fit into its idea of success. That's why she made it her mission to use her newfound platform to help others who might be struggling like she once did. One of her first big decisions was to open a music school right in her hometown. It wasn't some fancy academy with high tuition fees. It was a place where anyone, regardless of their background, could come and learn an instrument for free. The building itself was modest, a converted old warehouse near the edge of town. Inside, though, it buzzed with energy. Kids as young as 6 sat cross-legged on the floor, clutching tiny violins almost too big for their arms. Teenagers practiced scales on pianos donated by generous supporters, while adults timidly held guitars or flutes, learning notes for the very first time. The seamstress visited often, walking from room to room, offering guidance and encouragement. Her presence alone inspired confidence in her students. If someone like her, a woman who had started with nothing, could make such beautiful music, then surely they could too. Her generosity didn't stop there. She also organized weekly performances at local shelters and community centers, bringing music to people who rarely got to experience it. These shows weren't glamorous. Sometimes the audience consisted of just a handful of listeners sitting on folding chairs. But every note played felt meaningful, filling spaces that were often filled with silence or hardship. After one such performance, an elderly man approached her, tears in his eyes. "I haven't heard live music in years," he said, his voice cracking. "Thank you for reminding me what beauty still exists in this world." As word of her kindness spread, so did support for her cause. Donations poured in from across the country, musical instruments, funding for lessons, and even offers from professional musicians willing to volunteer their time. The little music school grew rapidly, becoming a beacon of hope for the entire town. Parents enrolled their children not just to learn music, but to learn resilience, creativity, and self-expression. For many families, it was a lifeline, a way to dream bigger than their circumstances allowed. Even the merchant's wife, now a close friend, played a role in supporting the initiative. She used her influence to rally wealthy patrons, organizing fundraisers and securing sponsorships. Together, they turned what had started as a personal apology into a partnership aimed at uplifting the community. Their bond proved that redemption was possible, no matter how rocky the beginning. Through it all, the seamstress stayed true to herself. Fame hadn't changed her heart. If anything, it deepened her gratitude. Every time she picked up her violin, whether on stage or in the privacy of her attic, she remembered the long nights spent practicing alone. Those moments had shaped her, not just as a musician, but as a person. They taught her patience, perseverance, and the value of staying authentic, even when the world tries to pull you in different directions. And yet, amidst all the accolades and achievements, she never forgot the lesson she'd learned that fateful night at the gala. Greatness isn't measured by applause or awards, but by the impact you leave on others. Her music had given her a voice, but it was her compassion and humility that truly defined her legacy. As she watched her students grow and flourish under her guidance, she realized something profound. The best symphony of all was the one created when people came together to build each other up. Years passed, and the seamstress's life continued to blossom in ways she could never have predicted. Her music school became more than just a place to learn instruments. It became a cornerstone of the community. People gathered there not only to practice melodies, but also to share stories, celebrate milestones, and find comfort during tough times. The once quiet town now hummed with the sound of violins, pianos, and laughter spilling out of the little converted warehouse. It was proof that even the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward, changing lives far beyond what anyone might expect. The seamstress herself remained a guiding presence at the school, though she eventually handed over much of the day-to-day work to younger teachers who had grown up under her mentorship. She still performed occasionally, but those concerts were rare and always deeply personal. Each performance carried echoes of her journey, the shy woman who had once stood trembling on a stage, clutching an old violin, unsure if anyone would listen. Now, when she played, audiences didn't just hear notes. They felt her story. They understood how resilience and passion could turn something ordinary into something extraordinary. One of her proudest moments came years later when one of her students, a boy named after his grandfather, won a prestigious national competition for young musicians. He was from a struggling family, the kind of background that usually gets overlooked. But thanks to the opportunities provided by the music school, he found his voice and his talent. When he dedicated his win to the seamstress during the award ceremony, calling her his guardian angel, she broke down in tears. Watching him succeed reminded her why she had started the school in the first place, to give others the chance she almost missed. Her legacy wasn't limited to the town either. News of her inspiring journey spread far and wide, inspiring countless people around the world. Documentaries were made about her life, books were written, and her compositions became staples in classical music curriculums. Yet, despite all the recognition, she stayed humble. Fame, she often said, wasn't the goal, it was simply a tool to do more good. As she grew older, she spent less time traveling and more time reflecting on her life. She loved sitting in her attic room, surrounded by memories, faded photographs of her mother, letters from grateful students, and her trusty violin resting quietly in its case. Sometimes, late at night, she'd play softly, letting the music carry her back through the years. Those quiet moments reminded her of where she came from and how far she'd come, not just geographically or professionally, but emotionally. She had transformed fear into courage, pain into purpose, and silence into song. When she finally passed away, peacefully in her sleep, the entire town mourned her loss. Her funeral was held in the same grand hall where she had stunned everyone with her unexpected performance decades earlier. This time, however, the room wasn't filled with mockery or doubt. It overflowed with love and gratitude. Former students, friends, and strangers whose lives she had touched lined up to pay their respects. The air vibrated with music as dozens of violins played her favorite pieces, a fitting tribute to the woman who had used her art to change the world. To this day, her memory lives on, not just in the music school that bears her name, but in every person she inspired to believe in themselves. Her story serves as a reminder that greatness isn't reserved for the wealthy, the educated, or the privileged. It belongs to anyone willing to pour their heart into what they love, no matter how daunting the odds may seem. And whenever someone picks up a violin, sits down at a piano, or hums a tune because it makes them feel alive, a piece of her lingers in the melody, whispering, "*You are capable of more than you know." Asterisk.